Okay, well, welcome back to the Cold War conference. So now here comes to panel 7, Migration, Exile, Defection. So I'm the panel chair, Dorothy Liew from the Academy of Film of HKBU. And in this panel, we will have totally 3 presentations. Now, let me introduce the first paper title as well as our presenter. So the first paper, which is entitled as Exiled Ecologies, Recollecting Cold War Sinophone Displacement. So the presenter is Zhou Liew. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Liew. Zhou Liew is currently visiting a scholar at National Taiwan University. He holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Pennsylvania and was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Mehandra Humanities Center at Harvard University. His work has appeared in critical Asia studies and postcolonial studies. He is writing a book about exile migrants and the spatial legacies of Cold War in Asia. Okay, now let me pass the time to Zhou Liew.
Thank you for the introduction. So I'll just share my screen here. 1 second. Okay. All right, do you see the screen?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, and I'm glad that you're here, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. I'm Zhou Liew, currently visiting a scholar at National Taiwan University, and my presentation is called Exile, Ecologies. So I want to begin with 2 quotes from writers who I will be discussing today. Zhu Tianxing, a Taiwanese writer, writes in her short story, In Remembrance of My Buddies in the Military Compound, that a land where none of your relatives are buried cannot be called home. Wang Yunhua, a writer from Malaysia, writes in his preface to his poetry collection, New Village, that this is the grave of my memories, burying all the events of the tropical rainforest, British colonialism, and the Malayan land. So as you can see, both writers are concerned about land and remembrance, and as I will go on to show, they are both narratives about ecology that deal with the legacy of Cold War resettlement. So this is part of my book project, Ecologies of the Uprooted. So Ecologies offers a transnational critique of Cold War representation in Asia by reading the cultural productions of uprooted Sinophone migrants across East and Southeast Asia. So in my book, I look at 6 case studies, which are organized around militarized settlements that these Sinophone migrants settled at during the Cold War. So my argument is that by reading and comparing their cultural productions, which recollect these settlements, an alternate picture of the Asian Cold War emerges, which challenges nation-centric Cold War narratives in the region. So these cultural productions include memoirs, oral histories, fiction, documentaries, and film, which depict land, ecology, and territory, hence the name Ecologies. So just a brief definition, for me, ecology just means the interaction between human environment, which produces settlements, technologies, practices, or you could say ways of adapting to space and place. So the case studies that I'm discussing today are from part A, which is about resettlement villages. And for this presentation, I want to focus on 2 sets of cultural productions, which discuss these resettlement villages through the lens of ecological heritage. So these are the Xingcun Wenben, or New Village texts, and the Zhencun Wenxue, or the literature about the military dependence village. I will spotlight some scenes and descriptions that intersect with the ecological in this literature, as they draw attention to the experience of exile and forced migration during the Cold War, and respond to state development in Malaya and Taiwan. So this paper is still a work in progress, so I welcome your thoughts and feedback on it. Okay, let's begin with the New Villages. Let me give some historical background before discussing the cultural productions. So what are the New Villages? Between 1948 to 1960, which is a period called the Malayan Emergency in Malaysia today, more than 500,000 rural ethnic Chinese were forcibly resettled into barbed wire compounds called the New Villages as part of British anti-communist and counter-insurgency policies. So the British colonial government conducted this mass resettlement policy to cut off support to largely ethnic Chinese communist guerrillas in the jungle, viewing the rural Chinese as possible communist sympathizers. So those who were resettled actually experienced regular surveillance, curfew, detention, and re-education, and some surviving villages even described the initial resettlement sites as concentration camps. But these resettlement sites were later renamed new villages, reflecting the British reframing of these places as sites of development for the rural Chinese. In the present, the barbed wires and guard posts have been removed, and most villages have just become regular villages. They have become towns as well, and some are even tourist sites, as in these photos. But how do the surviving villages and their descendants view this forced resettlement and the new villages? So the text I'm looking at today convey this point of view. They respond to the Cold War scripts of the Malaysian national narrative after independence, which frames the communist guerrillas as traitors and enemies to the state. But the state is still invested in controlling narratives about this period. For example, the film on your right, called Absent Without Leave, is a documentary tracing the surviving communist fighters, which was banned from screening in Malaysia. And the New Village text I'm looking at today respond to this absence in the national narrative by representing the point of view of the resettled. However, they also contend with the British Cold War framing of the new villages as sites of rural development by resurrecting a Nanyang ecology, that is to say, a way of life of the rural Chinese, embedded with the tropical jungle environment of Malaya that is lost through resettlement. So one might also say that these are post-colonial narratives responding to British colonialism. And the British colonial narratives of development are quite complex, as they are part of a larger Cold War discourse of rural development as counter-insurgency. I've explored this at length in an article in Critical Asian Studies, which you can refer to if you're interested. But to summarize, one of the main assumptions behind this resettlement as development idea, which can be seen in this propaganda pamphlet about a model new village, is that the rural Chinese were isolated squatters who lived primitive existences on the fringes of civilization. So in that sense, it justifies resettlement by describing the rural Chinese as primitive squatters of the land who need to be uplifted and civilized, which is a classic colonial narrative. And Wang Yunhua's writings challenge this colonial narrative by showing how it ignores the longer migratory and ecological history of the rural Chinese in Malaya. So Wang Yunhua is from a family of rubber planters, and here his families were resettled to a new village when he was 12 years old. And his essays and poetry remember the unique Nanyang Chinese settler culture that emerged from the interaction with the jungle environment, as many Chinese migrated to Malaya at the turn of the 19th century to work in the colonial economy of rubber plantations and tin mining. So in his 1981 essay called The Daily Bleeding Rubber Trees, later translated and collected into a collection of essays called Durians Are Not the Only Fruit, he calls this Nanyang Chinese migration a form of transplant. So like the rubber trees that were transplanted to Malaya by the British from South America, which adapted and prospered in this new land. So it has essays actually document this new Nanyang Chinese culture that emerged through transplanting. So he writes about food, flora, and fauna of the tropics, and most importantly, the cultivation practices of the rural Chinese, including rubber planting. So in that sense, transplant is a different kind of migratory movement compared with resettlement. And his poetry collection, called The New Village, documents the impact of resettlement on this Nanyang ecology, as villagers were forcibly uprooted from their homes, lost their livelihoods, moved away from places of cultivation near the jungle. And this can be seen in the poem that's on the screen right now, called Bat and Flower. So the beginning of this poem celebrates the beauty of nature, the interaction between the bat and the tropical jungle, and bat pollination is actually described as a dance with flowers. This pollination helps the jungle plants grow, and what it symbolizes here is the Nanyang Chinese role as cultivators in the rural ecology of Malaya. But this interaction with nature is interrupted by the chaos of the emergency, which forces the bat to leave the jungle. And because of that, the durians and bananas of the tropical jungle can only bear flowers once a year, as the bat no longer pollinates, only relying on the wind. Finally, the bat leaves the jungle, but cannot forget the gunshots of the emergency. So in that sense, the trauma of resettlement is expressed through a broken ecology, and the echoes of this violated ecology and lost livelihood persist for the rural Chinese. So to some, these new village texts I've talked about emphasize the ecological heritage of the rural Chinese as settlers and cultivators to counter the development narrative of the colonial British which viewed them as subjects without history. So that's the first part. Let's move on to the second case study. It's the military dependence village, or the Chun in Taiwan. So the Chun has a different history. During the Chinese Civil War between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, about 1 to 1.5 million war refugees moved from mainland China to Taiwan after the CCP took over the mainland. So many of these refugees were KMT soldiers and their families. The Chun were thus what Dominic Yang calls residential enclaves established by the KMT army for its married personnel in his book, The Great Exodus. So that's why the militarized name is there. These were thought of as temporary housing, as the goal of the KMT regime was to take back the mainland initially. And the construction of the Chun was quite uneven from 1949 to the late 1960s, with illegal shanty towns sprouting up next to legal army housing across Taiwan. But from 1980 onwards, these around 900 Chun were marked for demolition, accompanying the Taiwan economic boom, which demanded more land for the construction of high-density housing, parks, recreational spaces, basically urban development. And this led to clashes between Chun residents and city governments. For example, in Taipei, which witnessed activism centered around preserving these villages. And the most recent site of contention is a place called Daguan, which Chun was demolished in 2019, as you can see on the screen. But moving back to the 1990s, another place of activism is today's Da'an Forest Park, Da'an Seneng Gongyuan, which was a site of several informal villages whose residents were evicted in 1992. That's on the top left, and the park is on the top right. So in that quarter site, which is from a Lonely Planet guidebook, Da'an Forest Park is presented as a mix of global and local, like Central Park in New York, but also with unique local characteristics like Chinese chess and Guanyin. So this is an urban development that reflects global, even what you could call local aspirational trends. And while we shouldn't rely on Lonely Planet too much for analysis, I do think that this quote reflects a kind of globalization ideal that places the city as part of a network of global cities, a kind of global green ideal even. In Taipei, at least, the Chun has been reconceived as heritage buildings. And one of these, called Sisi Nanchun, which is very close to the Taipei 101, as you can see in the picture, is a museum and tourist area that preserves a small portion of the original settlements. So the texts I'm looking at are from the 1980s and 1990s, which is the peak of Chun cultural production. So ecology here is linked with family, and what do I mean by that? So these photos of the Chun from an online digital archive created by the descendants of those who moved preserves images of old Chun, and many of them are familial portraits. So I want to suggest that Chun Wenche is a former local heritage building, which counteracts this global development ideal by reflecting on the idea of roots and ancestry. So for example, Zhu Tianxing's short story, in Remembrance, is told from the point of view of an unnamed female narrator who grew up in a Chun who has left the village. It's a nostalgic recap of her coming of age with an impetus to document the sights, sounds, and characters that typify a Chun. So although it tells of her coming of age, it also captures the preoccupations of the previous generation, the refugees who moved from the mainland. And one of these preoccupations is with the status of Chun land, which legally did not belong to them, even though they lived there, hence all the demolition and evictions. And the quotes up here are from a scene where she describes the Tomb Sweeping Festival, which is a day where one goes to the graves of ancestors to pay respects and give offerings. However, the narrator reflects that they, meaning the refugees and their descendants, didn't have any tombstones to sweep. So this absence showed that they have no ancestors on the land, nowhere to go or to give offerings. And as a child, she writes, what she did on this day was to hang out around local tombstones instead. Her parents, on the other hand, would burn paper money in their backyard. And you can see the description of the local public tombstones, and the second line is full of vitality and freshness, a springtime narrative that suggests that this is part of an ecology of regeneration. So tending and remembering the dead is part of a cycle of life in that sense. And this is in contrast with her parents burning paper money in their backyard, where they can only remember the dead in a private space without knowing whether their relatives were still alive on the mainland. So it's a kind of strange in-between position, heightened because travel to mainland China was prohibited until the late 1980s. It was difficult to establish communication with relatives. So if we consider this, the mainland refugees stay in a limbo outside of the ecology of the land. And because of that, she writes, a land where none of your relatives are buried cannot be called home. So they are estranged from the present ecology of Taiwan. Another example of this estrangement can be found in the 1983 film, Papa, Can You Hear Me Sing? So this film is also narrated by a female character called Ah-mei, who grows up in a Zhenzun. She is an orphan adopted by a veteran who took part in the Civil War and now lives in the Zhenzun as a bottle peddler. So these film stills are from an early scene of the film where Ah-mei has just been adopted. The father, who is mute because of injuries he suffered in the war, is performing his trumpet for a village celebration. The film cuts to a flashback where he is playing trumpet on the battlefield, and it shows these soldiers surrounded by desiccated trees, leaflet branches, smoke and fire, a kind of war ecology that is destructive, which is the opposite of generative. We are not told how he survives this war, but the film cuts back to the present, where the narrator Ah-mei intones that he used to have family, but he has lost everything and now only possesses memories. So the film then shows him carrying a baby who is Ah-mei in front of the ancestral altar, paying respects to the ancestors, as the baby is now the continuation of his family line. So we can see then a visual representation of what was in the short story. The child becomes a symbol of regeneration, a building back of lineage to compensate for the destruction of ecology during wartime. However, the film has a tragic ending as its climax revolves around the destruction of the Zhenzun and eviction of its residents. So as you can see here, it's surrounded by demolitionists, as the crane destroys a house, what is left is pieces of broken wood, a motif that evokes the desiccated trees in the previous scene. And his daughter has left the Zhenzun at this point and they become estranged. So the lineage is broken here. He is unable to establish permanent roots in this place. He is only left with the broken wood. So in conclusion, both the Zhenzun and Xingchun texts depict ecology in relation to development. The Xingchun text stage scenes of cultivation, making claims to rural Malaya as a place of Nanyang ecological heritage prior to resettlement. So in that way, they challenge the new village developmental narratives of the British colonial state. The Zhenzun texts, on the other hand, participate in a kind of heritage building by reflecting on issues of roots and ancestry. And they show how a certain generation of war refugees are estranged from the ecology of Taiwan as they are unable to create a family, lineage, or permanent kinship on Zhenzun land, which is subject to state development. And both are Cold War legacies that persist until the present day. So that's my presentation. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Good. Very great presentation. Thank you. Now, let me introduce our second presenter, Dr. I-ting Chen. So Dr. Chen received her PhD in Cultural Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, where she is currently a part-time lecturer at the Department of Cultural Studies. Her research interests include Cold War politics, sex work, gender and sexuality, migration, and cross-strait intimacy. So today, Dr. Chen will present a paper with the topic, Toward the Cold War, the sentiments of anti-communism and anti-prostitution in the narrative of Dalumei, Mainland little sister in Taiwan. Now, may I pass the time to Dr. Chen?
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, very clearly.
Okay. Thank you. Then I'll just start. This will be a short presentation, and good afternoon, everyone. I am I-ting Chen as the thank you for the introduction, and I'm glad to be here today. So the paper I present today, titled Towards the Cold War, the sentiment of anti-communism and anti-prostitution in the narrative of Dalumei in Taiwan, looks at the portrayal of mainland Chinese migrant women, such as the portrayal of them, right? Like such as Dalumei or Daluren. Or even nowadays, because of the COVID, later I'm going to talk more about it, they are even seen as the dangerous virus. And all these kind of portrayal and its relations with the narrative of anti-communism and anti-prostitution in Taiwan. So let me just begin with the questions. So shedding light on the ongoing entanglement of everyday life and the structure of feeling in the post-Cold War and post-colonial East Asia. The scholar Chen Guangxin, the author of the book Asia as Method Toward the Imperialization, draws attention to what he calls the imperialization, the Cold War, and decolonization. In this paper, I discuss possibilities and difficulties of the Cold War through looking at how the portrayal of Dalumei and virus associates mainland Chinese migrant women with their productive labor. For example, I pay attention to these women's roles as mainland wives, mistresses of Taiwanese businessmen, or hostesses and sex workers in the Taiwanese society. Dalumei, which can be translated as mainland little sister, Dalu and Mei, right, refers to not only the migrant women from mainland China, but also a type of lactus, the vegetable imported from mainland China. And this shows the connotation of mainland little sister in a different way, right? So Taiwanese people would say why they call this lactus imported from mainland China as Dalumei, partly because it's the sound of this lactus is mei, right, moyacai, and because it was imported from mainland China. But more importantly, also because it is young, the lactus is young, cheap, juicy, and tasty, right? And this was mentioned by a mainland Chinese spouse, Liew, who is also a YouTuber, explained on her YouTube channel, right? So the Chinese mainland and a young woman implied in the word Dalumei manifest Taiwan's special history of the Chinese Civil War, the legacy of the Cold War in East Asia, and finally, the feminist sex wars in Taiwan. Since the early 2000s, Taiwan has branded itself as a nation of gender equality and democracy. And I put a question mark here because, however, the state's surveillance over the authenticity of cross-strait marriage and the mainland spouse's loyalty to the nation still manifests an anti-communist mentality against the Cold War other in the post-Cold War era. As the history of the Cold War and Taiwan's feminist sex wars on licensed prostitution in the late 1990s continues to shape people's feelings and emotions across the strait, cross-strait intimacy under the geopolitical and historical conditions remains the subject in need of further examination. And this is also why I want to further pursue this topic in this paper. As such, this paper investigates the paradox of cross-strait intimacy, including hostility, desire, and fear. It understands how mainland Chinese hostesses become a trap that maintains the sentiment of anti-communism and anti-prostitution in the post-Cold War context in Taiwan. So let me introduce you briefly my research methods. So between 2018 and 2020, I conducted field work for over 7 months in the erotic day house in Taipei, where mainland Chinese hostesses spent time entertaining their Taiwanese clients. So I see this place as a place where I can see the kind of cross-strait interactions and the so-called what I call cross-strait intimacy. So let me just go into give you more background. So after the enactment of cross-strait exchange in the late 1980s, cross-strait marriage later became a way for women to migrate from mainland China to Taiwan in order to pursue their dreams, right? Meanwhile, to promote the global agenda of anti-human trafficking, so these two kind of affairs happen simultaneously, right? During the same time, to promote the global agenda of anti-human trafficking and the gender mainstreaming led by the US and UN, United Nations. Taiwanese government enacted policies aiming at protecting women and children from sexual offenders to prevent, and as part of this broader agenda, to prevent cross-strait marriage become a way to smuggle mainland Chinese women for prostitution in Taiwan. The widely known, it's also widely known as sham marriage, actually prostitution, 假结婚真卖淫. Marriage interview at the airport was enforced as the policy by the government in early 2000s. This policy, on the one hand, aims to protect mainland Chinese migrant women. They are seen as potential victims in this context, while on the other hand, monitors their behaviors as appropriate daughters-in-law of Taiwanese families, right? Taiwan Xifu. For example, they must not engage in sex commerce in Taiwan. The policy and state power controlling over the migrant women's bodies and sexuality simultaneously prevailed and reinforced the sentiment of anti-communism in the imagination of Dalumei, mainland little sister, a sexual and national threat to Taiwanese society. Meanwhile, the Cold War sentiment can be perceived in the way in which the circulation of the US feminism globally and how it contributed to the US Cold War project in Asia. As a result, elements such as virtue and integrity during the Cold War period were hugely mobilized in justifying a superior political model, including strategically claiming a superior system for women. As Helen Liew accurately put, quote, through the medium of the UN, the Soviet Union and the USA became involved in a battle over which political system best assured the status of women, end of quote. Combining the US feminist project with a global ranking system targeting human trafficking in the non-West, such as Taiwan, anti-communism is translated into a global task in eliminating authoritarianism and patriarchy. And this was mentioned by another feminist scholar, Dinai Fei, as well. In what follows now, I further examine what I call the Cold War virus through shedding some light on the portrayal of mainland Chinese migrant women who work as hostess and the erotic tea house in Taipei. So first of all, this is a conversation between the hostess Xiaomei, another hostess, and me. So this sentence now you can see is from Xiaomei, right? She said, I was like, you cursed mainlander. I was like, but whoever you try to date is always mainlander. And she spoke in Mandarin, of course, so this is my translation. So the hostess Xiaomei's boyfriend is a Taiwanese man, right? According to Xiaomei, despite his current and former girlfriends are all from mainland China, he often despises mainland Chinese people. The question raised in Xiaomei's conversation here is that, why did he date mostly mainlanders if he does not like them? So now let me explain the both hostile and intimate sentiment through another example. It's from a Taiwanese client's opinion about mainland Chinese hostesses and their business strategy. So below conversation is part of it's from part of my interview with both Tian, a client in the tea house, a Taiwanese client in the tea house. It was conducted in late January in the year 2020. So it was last year. When the spread of the virus, now we know COVID-19, when the spread of the virus, particularly in Wuhan city in mainland China at the time, had already caught people's attention in the tea house area where I did my field work at the time. During our interview, both Tian borrowed the term virus to describe the subject we were talking about, a common business strategy in the tea house known as return the table. So to briefly introduce you, what does it mean by saying return the table? That's a culture in the tea house where when one hostess, she has a client, right? And when her client comes to visit her in the tea house, the hostess can invite her sisters to sit together so they all get paid by the client. So after this, all of her sisters will owe her a favor, right? So later they will return her the favor by inviting her to their tables, which will be paid by their clients as well. So this kind of return the table, this culture is very important in the tea house district. And it will force the clients to spend a lot more money because you cannot just pay for one hostess. If you want to sit with the hostess you like, you are often required to pay for like 10 more hostesses. But in this way, all the hostesses can earn a lot more as well, right? You can see like so many times more. Okay, so the client, both Tian, he was basically kind of complaining about this thing, right? He told me that the business strategy, return the table, was initiated by mainland Chinese hostesses when they started to work in the tea house 10 years ago. He maintained that the strategy was later adopted by Taiwanese hostesses as well, right? And then he said the non-mainland Chinese hostesses, right, including the Taiwanese hostesses and the hostesses from other places. So he said they're all infected, just like the SARS in Wuhan, because at the time the virus issue was also kind of a topic in our conversation. So he said they're all infected, just like the SARS in Wuhan. They are all infected. So he emphasized again. Moreover, he explained the vicious impact to me through saying the sentence here. About 10 years ago, the clients followed mainland women's rules because of what? Because the mainland Chinese hostesses are good at acting affectionately. 他们很会撒娇, cheating on men and fleecing men. However, they are only after your money. To acquire your money, she does whatever it takes. She's like, well, since I know you're a client, so I sleep with you. I sleep with you so that you will come to patronize me the next day. So depicting mainland Chinese hostesses as virus and their influence as infection, the evil image portrayed by both Tian echoes with the social anxiety and the representation of Dalumei towards mainland Chinese women as the other of the Cold War and the feminist wars in Taiwan. The depiction of virus signaled a bad influence that was transmissive and infectious, whereas the participants of the erotic tea houses were the carriers and the transmitters, as implied in the aforementioned conversations. So the question remains here is, given the both hostile and intimate feelings between people across the strait, how can we think about, strategies or solutions towards the Cold War, like Chen Guangxin mentioned, in the contemporary Taiwanese society, as well as East Asia? So this is my short presentation, so I look forward to some discussion later. Thank you.
Now, let me introduce our next presenter. So Dr. Kenny Ng, who is sitting next to me. Dr. Ng is the Associate Professor at the Academy of Film of HKBU. His published books include The Lost Geopoetic Horizon of Li Jianren, The Crisis of Writing Chengdu in Revolutionary China, 2015. In the Escape, Hong Kong, Interviews and Essays, 2018. Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow, Hong Kong Cinema and Sino Links in Politics, Art and Tradition, 2021. His ongoing book projects concern censorship and visual cultural politics in Cold War Hong Kong and Asia, the politics of Cantonese language and Sinophone cinemas, and left-wing cosmopolitanism. So today, Dr. Ng will be presenting a paper, and the paper title is A Man Without a Country, British Imperial Nostalgia in Ferry to Hong Kong, 1959. So,
okay, thank you. Thank you, Dorothy, for introducing me. Thank you, my colleagues of the school for organizing this wonderful event. So I have a chance to present my working paper, working topic. And thanks all my students, okay, for helping so much and working so hard to prepare everything. Let me share my PowerPoint first. Okay. Share screen.
Yeah.
I see.
share screen.
Okay. PowerPoint. This one.
Yeah,
Yes. 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 Okay. So I think time is in my hand, luckily. So I've spent a couple of minutes to introduce this story. Okay. So I think like many of the topics you may encounter in your career, in your research, this is found actually by some accident. Okay. I just talked to my colleague, Chen here. Basically, I found a 5-minute clip that you're going to see at the end of my presentation of this film on YouTube. Okay. So someone just want to show some Hong Kong nostalgia. And because this 5-minute beginning opening credits actually have this Kurt Jurgens character, okay, wandering around the western south coastline of Kowloon. Right now, it is the Hong Kong China terminal, speed train terminal. Okay, and this is the film made invested by a British RAND organization. Okay, so for a long time, I've presumed that the British government was never interested in producing their own films of their own interest in Hong Kong for a very diplomatic strategy. And it proves that maybe this is the only one film, only one significant film made by the British government based in Hong Kong. Still, it's not a Hong Kong story, but it's half a Hong Kong story. So interestingly, sounds that few people knew about this film. We have known about a lot about the world of Susie Wong, Love Is Friends, things made by Hollywood. Okay, so I think interesting. I think in the morning we have a panel on memories. I think here amnesia is also important to think about. Okay, so let me read my speech here. Okay. Okay, I try to handle this. Okay. Yeah. So on New Year's Eve 1959, Ferry to Hong Kong was screened at the Lee Theatre and the Astor in Hong Kong. Produced by RAND organization as its first CinemaScope feature, the film directed by Louis Gilbert was shot on location in Hong Kong and Macau from October 1958 to February 1959. Okay. The big budget movie contracting British box office star Kurt Jurgens and famed American director Orson Welles was marketed as RAND's international film targeting the US market. I think at first sight it was unbelievable. Orson Welles played in Hong Kong. I never heard about this, right? It is, yeah, it was. The film tells a real life story of Stephen Reagan, a stateless drifter who was stuck for 10 months between 1952 and 1953 on the ferry shuttling between Hong Kong and Macau. Reagan's born a Hungarian-Austrian exile citizen, had worked in a Shanghai bar before he escaped after the communist takeover. He arrived in Macau in 1952, where his permit was revoked, and he then sneaked on a Hong Kong Hong Kong Macau ferry to avoid deportation to the PRC. The international press keenly reported on his unusual but never vindicated story, subsequently fictionalized by Simon Kent in Ferry to Hong Kong, the novel with the same name. In the film adaptation, the Hong Kong police deport Mark Conrad, played by Kurt Jürgen. Okay, so Conrad is the name of the protagonist. After the drunken Anglo-Austrian exile, having made trouble at the nightclub, Conrad was tossed around aboard the ferry called Fat Annie with a one-way ticket to Macau. When Macau rejects him as an undesirable, Conrad becomes a man without a country. Taking the ferry as his makeshift home, he finds himself in a romance with Liz Ferris, played by Sylvia Sim, a kind-hearted schoolteacher cruising with her Chinese students on the passenger boat. British critics disapproved Orson Welles in this Anglo-American film venture as his, quote, worst ever performance. Let's see if I, yeah, it's very funny here, yeah. They found the American mimicking the accents of great British politicians just with comic touches. Director Lewis Gilbert described the shooting experience simply as nightmarish. Jurgens and Welles actually swapped the roles before filming. Actually, they swapped the roles to play. Jurgens played the drunken man and Exile, and then Welles played the captain. Actually, the roles was reversed in the beginning. Jurgens and Welles actually swapped the roles before filming. Reportedly, the British and American stars hated each other, and they could sparsely shoot together on the set. And more, the bossy and arrogant Welles often did change his lines in shooting. So he had a lot of improvisation on his own. Welles once had a terrible hand-up as he lost his false nose that he habitually put on in filming. I just find that he put on the false nose in his, he complained that his nose was not big enough, okay, on the screen, thus delaying the shooting as he demanded local workers to look for a new false nose in town. Oops. Orson Welles called Hong Kong a, quote, free, wide open city and a new third man territory, pompously referring to the Third Man made in 1949, a British film that captured the paranoia and vulnerability of Vienna during the four-power occupation of Austria between 1945 to 1955, in which Welles played Harry Limes, a sleazy character that was partly inspired by Kim Philby, the notorious British double agent for the Soviet Union. Orson Welles imagined Hong Kong as a permissive city for crimes and adventures. He himself actually was particularly interested in the underground world of the colony, such as the details of smuggling human snakes from Red China to Hong Kong, and the stealing of electric cable, which caused blackouts on the island. Welles also brought along his camera and did documentary filming on subjects like Chinese funeral during the filming. So basically, Welles was multitasking. It's very, very, very sensitive, this mouse. Okay. Okay. Besides the legendary Welles, the film cast local Chinese actor Roy Chow. Okay, it should be here. Okay. This is Roy Chow. as the Americanized Johnny Sing Up. In Cantonese, we call him Q1, Qiao Hong. Okay. A black leather jacket and blue jean wearing Elvis Presley style gangster on the bottom left picture, you can see from America. Okay. So it looks like he's an American gangster, but actually he ends up a Chinese pirate, which is still mysterious to me in the film. But then Roy Chow was a major actor of MP and GI, a famous Mandarin film comedy, which according to Po Fu, was, quote, inadvertently entangled in the Cold War politics of anti-communism. The owner of MP and GI, the film company called Luk Wan Tao, identified with Free China, which was Taiwan, okay, as the custodian of Chinese culture and thereby the only legitimate Chinese government, where most of the studio's employees came from the anti-communist exile community. In addition, the MPGI produced film Air Hostess, which you can find on the right-hand side, the picture of Air Hostess, where Roy Chow starred with Grace Chan, a very famous Mandarin actress. Okay, starring Roy Chow and Grace Chan, okay, contained, according to Po Fu, pro-Taiwan propaganda and celebrated US-supported industrial modernity and beauty of free China. Roy Chow's participation in the British film gained coverage in Taiwan as he was regarded by Taiwan as, quote, a Chinese actor of my country. Okay, so here is very sensitive. Okay, his role in the film was highlighted in international screen, MPGI's movie magazine, as he told his interviewer that it was, quote, an honor of my life to work with great British stars and to be filmed in CinemaScope. Chow also told the interviewer how he had made suggestions to the director to modify some of the dialogues to avoid racial discrimination against Chinese. Orson Welles originally had a line, according to Chow, like, quote, I would rather die than giving out this ferry to you dirty Chinese. Dirty Chinese was then changed to dirty Oriental, okay? What's the difference? Yet, unsurprisingly, no commentators, Chinese and expatriates alike, level criticism at the British film's Orientalist gaze in the fashion of Hollywood. While by 1960, it could still be too soon to recognize Hollywood's stock image of Chinese pirates. Here we have our latest Chinese pirate played by Zhou Yunfa, okay, in Pirates of the Caribbean #3, and the pirate image in Ferry to Hong Kong. I find they actually look alike. Okay, so still, an expatriate reader of the South China Morning Post here of the South China Morning Post complained that the stinging of the ship in Victoria Harbour in the film, surrounded by sampans in the finale, quote, gives a particularly insulting impression of Hong Kong. And the only onshore impression given of Hong Kong is a place, here we have the right on the picture on the left-hand side, of drunken brawls in bars full of double girls frequented by sailors of many countries. So this was written by a Western reader from the South China Morning Post complaining about the Orientalism of this movie. But more importantly, the film's Orientalism went far beyond the movie screen to real-life social gatherings in London. Ferry to Hong Kong was promoted as a blockbuster in the UK as one of the most ambitious British films for years. It received a spectacular world premiere of the same scale in London on the 2nd of July, 1959. It was a glamorous night with fireworks and an Orient theme party. About 1,000 guests were invited. Some celebrities arrived on sampan across the River of Thames, while Juggins and Sims, the star actor and actress, arriving riding a rickshaw. A buffet with exotic Chinese dishes like honey grasshoppers were delivered by ethnic Chinese girls in chengsams and served with chopsticks. Chinese lanterns and dragons were hung in the venue, booths offering fortune tellers and name translation into Chinese are also set up for the guest entertainment. Inevitably, the storytelling is freighted with thrilling action toward a climatic ending when the storm drifts the ship to dangerous Chinese waters, where pirates boarded the ship to raid the wealthy and passengers. Aided by Captain Hart and the crew, Conrad overcomes the pirates and comes close to steering the storm-battered ferry back to port, but it finally sinks in Hong Kong harbor. The storytelling could be cinematically told as to how the British and his American ally overpowered the savage Chinese pirates as they trespassed the communist territory. More dramatically, in the actual shooting, the crew encountered real communist threats as they were filming on the Macau coast near the PRC, which was Zhuhai today, near Zhuhai border, okay? Communist protesters on the Chinese shore actually reportedly warned against the crew's filming by waving red flags and playing propaganda songs, warning that they are trespassing Chinese territories off the coast, okay? The director, Gilbert, responded with broadcasting a humorous speech and playing jazz music. Gilbert was quoted as yelling at the communist activists onshore, quote, "If you have to arrest someone, go for our cinematographer." We don't know why he picked on the cinematographer, okay? Yeah, so that's the story. Now we come to the film, very briefly, about the meanings, okay, that I'm still exploring. Whereas the in-between territory of Chinese seas between Hong Kong and Macau signifies the underground routes of pirates, smugglers, and refugees, the drifting and sinking Fat Annie, the boat, is overloaded with significations of the colonial city. The ferry is overcrowded with passengers, just as post-war Hong Kong is flooded by Chinese refugees, still occupied with a strict colonial class division of Western British ruling elites and poorer Chinese passengers. Okay. The film certainly projects the image of benign British colonials. Whereas the woman, the school teacher, is the missionary look woman taking care of her well-educated diasporic Chinese students. Conrad shows his respect for the coffin-carrying fellow passengers, while the pirates rudely dispose their coffin in the sea. So they may stand for communists, which uprooted Chinese traditions, whereas Conrad, the British colonial, actually respect the Chinese tradition. The floating ship is here, where Conrad and Ferris, having their fleeting romance, unwittingly reveals British fears and the precariousness of Hong Kong in resisting the infiltration of communist China. The communist takeover of the city seemed distant, but it was doomed to happen. So this was a 1958 report from Washington Post, okay? Saying that Hong Kong governments and business leaders add all this up and feel that much can happen and many quick profits turning over, okay? So Hong Kong is still a good place for making money for the businessman. Only that it was time because already 1997 was on the agenda. Of course, it was not revealed to the public at that moment. So they feel that the island is on Red China's timetable, but well done, the priority reached, okay? But time flies. Okay, so Ferry to Hong Kong was more than the adventurous story of a vagabond who tries to redeem himself. Who tries to redeem himself and salvage self-respect and a future from the wreck as the ferry goes down in the sea. The uneasy Anglo-American cooperation was not only attributed to Orson Welles' arrogance or non-compliance on the set. Ferry to Hong Kong could be seen as an anxious cinema, as termed by Sue Harper and Vincent Porter, eager to reestablish British national assurance on Asian Cold War fronts. following the 1956 Suez Canal debacle that witnessed the passing of the British Empire might and the international influence of at the hands of the Eisenhower administration. The British film obviously could not be compared with its Hollywood counterparts in popularity. The vaunted Hollywood pictures, to say the least, included Soldiers of Fortune, Love is a Many Splendid Thing, The Will of Susie Wong, The Chairman, which imagined American white knights' incursions in Hong Kong as a stand-in for China, as transgressions across the restricted frontiers of Red China. So the question is, can political propaganda be apolitically made as entertainment? How can a film designed to inform and instruct an audience with a yearning for respite from politics in popular culture? Lewis Gilbert would soon later make The Seventh Heaven, The Seventh Dawn, now 1964, about the retreat of British colonial forces from Malaya after World War II, another collaborative production starring William Holden as an American major. The film preceded Gilbert's 3 James Bond series that affirmed the power of the individual, a British agent, in cracking transboundary networks of espionage and political intrigue. In comparison, Ferry to Hong Kong conveyed the sentiments of imperial nostalgia and loss by portraying a stateless subject, a descendant of the doomed empire. Okay, so here I just recycle the title of the novel by the famous British-Japanese novelist about a the declining British aristocratic family, okay, precisely in the year 1956, or in the 50s, where the Suez Canal event happened that I just mentioned in my talk. Okay, so I think today I would stop here, and I welcome questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ng, for the wonderful presentation. So originally, this panel still
I
have.
forgot to show. Yeah.
Sure.
I'm just so drawn to my presentation. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So there's still a 5-minute clip. How can I go back to? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this is the first 5-minute clip about this share the screen. Share the screen. Okay. This is the first 5-minute clip of the film about Conrad just waking up. Oh boy, sorry. I'll put this. Yes. Is that sound? And you have with the sound.
Share screen. Share screen. And you need to insert the screen, and when you share it, it has a box that says sound.
Okay.
Share screen.
Sound.
To share the question, right?
Video.
Sure.
Video. Okay, then you have.
Yeah, this one.
Others you may.
Sound.
You need to enable the sound.
That's the coach. That's the coach. Coach line. Pauline. So it's the sunset.
What is this, huh?
Come along, sir. You better come with us.
Aren't you the doorman?
Certainly not.
Oh, you can't sit down, huh?
Hey, you started all this now. Out. Get me a taxi.
Aren't you the doorman? You can't sit down, huh?
You started all this now. Out. Oh, it's you again, huh? Same old lot.
What do you mean? Different joint? Never break up the same joint twice.
3 times in 2 weeks. You fought it this time, Conrad.
Inspector!
Oh, it's you again.
I charge this man with insulting behavior and common assault.
Who's got a bin? I want to see if he bursts.
If I had you aboard my ship, I'd clap you in irons.
All right, Captain, let him be.
I charge this man with insulting behavior and common assault.
I'm a man of influence in this colony. I'll speak to the governor. I'll have you expelled.
If I had you aboard
Why
my
don't you
ship,
go on
I'd clap
driving
you in
your
irons.
left?
All right, Captain. Okay, get him out, Captain.
So, son, this 50.
Excuse me, Captain, I'm a little late.
I
don't know how to handle Apple.
Okay.
Okay.
Wow.
Sorry, it's been a confusion, but that's exactly what the film is driving at.
Well, great. Okay, yeah, thank you, Kenny. Okay, so originally this panel have the fourth paper. Unfortunately, Dr. Jinhee Park is not able to attend today. Therefore, that's it. Okay, so after the three wonderful presentations, so I think we can open the floor, yeah, for Q&A. So if you have any comments and questions, please share with us so that yeah, we can have some discussions. Okay. So if you have any question, you can either speak up or type your question in the chat box. Okay. Okay. Yes, Kenneth.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting, Kenny. So I think you mentioned that you hadn't known of this film before, and it's appeared on YouTube, right?
Yes.
So I just wanted to ask, first of all, it's hard to imagine that people haven't heard of this film.
Maybe they have maybe I didn't know about it.
Okay, maybe other people.
Maybe just my ignorance. Yeah.
So it's on YouTube, and I suppose maybe there are lots of comments that maybe a younger generation might have put underneath. What are they saying about it? You know, are the meanings to this younger generation who turns to YouTube? Is it what you expected? The political meanings and is it something that you?
I see. I didn't quite recall, but I think the basic picture is there are a lot of like old Hong Kong photos, people, events, and the clips. So the clips actually is about whole Hong Kong. So that's the coast, the Kowloon Coast line. And what actually captured me is also what it looked like in the 1950s. Okay, so they didn't even actually comment about the film. I don't know how they got the clip from the beginning. Okay, I think you also find the beginning 5 minutes on YouTube. Okay, so I think this is a kind of like local subjectivity. Okay, there's a lot of things going on YouTube. Sorry, on Facebook. Old movies, old posters. Okay, and that kind of things. Yeah, nostalgia. Okay, yeah. So I think that is it. But what's more interesting to me, of course, this film is totally made from the British interest. I think I just had no space to comment on the overall story. There's a lot of political connotations. For example, the American captain and the British passenger, the kind of tensions relationships. Okay, these are very interesting, very important because actually UK and US did not really come to terms very well concerning Hong Kong affairs. The UK government always complain on archives, on the documents that you're just too nosy and doing so much. You're trying to be the guardian, and this is my place. But at the end, of course, they were on the same anti-communist front line. Okay, and the British government also very cautious, very alert to communist infiltration. Okay, so the movie actually kind of like dramatized the situation about a Western subject. What I was very interested in. The man actually was a stateless man. Okay, and there was actually a real life story. Okay, of course that kind of story is a lot of like fiction going into it. So I think another challenge for looking at this film, criticizing this film, of course, when you are working on this kind of like Hollywood, British-made movies about an Asian stories, you often will be labeled as kind of Orientalism, right? And you'll be criticized, right? How come still bothering about these kind of films? But how could we like selfish our own subjectivity, okay, our local consciousness, especially as you mentioned, right? Right now, we use this part of this film clip on our Facebook to mean something else, okay? To mean the old Hong Kong we are missing. I think that's a kind of like, as you suggest, a kind of political gesture, okay? So maybe I would like to also make this paper, make this chapter with this kind of political gesture. Okay, yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. I have to watch this film now. It's very interesting. But my question is more related to the conference theme, right? Cold War.
Oh, Cold War, yes.
And not so much about Western representations of Hong Kong.
Yes.
Hong Kong has its own film industry.
Yeah.
Pretty very important at some point
right.
In the Cold War.
Yes.
So what was the representation of Red China in Hong Kong films? How was it different from the Western representations?
Yeah. Of course, in this film, the what is very subtle, okay, implicit reference to the pirates, okay, and one of these interesting, important core theme in this movie is not just in this film, but also in like the Chairman, the other Hollywood films, is how these Westerners, right, trespass or venture into the forbidden territory of Red China. And in reality, of course, that was forbidden, okay? So in the Hollywood film like The Chairman, which I talked about in my book, and the scientist, like a spy, actually sneaked into, venture into Red China, into China in Cultural Revolution, and also have a romance, okay, there. So this kind of like a James Bond film, this kind of like cracking up the mysteries of Red China, of Communist China, is part of this like cultural products of mainstream Hollywood, of Western imagination. But in this film is even more subtle because the British mentality is different from the Hollywood mentality. So here, this kind of like the pirates pose as kind of challenges and the stability of the passengers, okay? And so the Conrad's role, finally, he regained his like courage. He's not coward, and then he actually saves the people, become kind of Hollywood style hero. I think there's a lot of like subtlety, instability, anxiety on the British side. And if we look at British attitudes on Hong Kong particularly in the first 10 years after 1949, okay, there was of course a high alert about communist infiltration, and we all know that like after during the war or immediately after the war, China could anytime just took back Hong Kong if they will, okay. So it is kind of like, that's also the famous remark to borrow time and borrow place to describe Hong Kong and identity. So I think the British colonials had this very clear in their mind, or consciously in their mind, okay. So I think what I'm interested in how they reflected in this film, particularly the ship is very symbolic, okay. And the kind of like politics, it's not about Hong Kong, it's about politics, political tension with China. And before that, actually, the Britain made another film called the HMS, which is called the Battle of Hell. It's about the ship. In 1949, the British ship actually was stranded in the River Yans and being attacked by the communists. And then they made the final escape from China. The film was made in 1949, but it was never shown in Hong Kong, probably for fear of infuriating the Chinese government, I think. So I think that kind of capturing the kind of subtlety, nervousness of Cold War paranoia mentality in this period. I think, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So we have a couple of questions from our online audiences. Maybe we can go to Tarek first.
Thank you very much, and my apologies that you can't see me. It's a problem with my computer. I think you can hear me.
Yes.
I have a question, and it's probably very trivial, and my apologies for that as well. So we have a hero, sorry, who ventures into some sort of heart of darkness in big scare quotes, right? And there's an obvious allusion to Joseph Conrad, right? Even in the name of the hero. It reminds me immediately of Apocalypse Now, you know, which is a retake on Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, transposed to Asia and transposed into the Vietnam War, and in that sense into the Cold War. And all of that makes me think about this particular relationship that seems to be here between stories that are pre-Cold War, that are about imperialism, colonialism, the old empires, and stories that become Cold War stories and then are set again in Orientalized Asia or maybe somewhere else. I think, for instance, I see hints of similar effects around Istanbul, as it were, where I happen to live, in the depictions of it in Western movies. I'd be very interested in your opinion on this.
Oh, yeah. I think it's, I never dare think about that. Conrad and Heart of Darkness is my favorite story as well. And all this movie and how Americans made use of this story. And I think there are also the bigger scenarios, okay, about the Cold War powers. What I'm just reminded of is about Orson Welles and the headlines coverage about the Third Man City, okay? Yeah. So it was a lot of labels, right? The Berlin and then the Third Man City, okay, referring to Vienna. Yeah. So kind of like telling us about, of course, this is our subjectivity has been hidden, has been shelved by these big powers. I think there's something we would like to, how this relating to these scenarios help us to regain our historical sense and historical subjectivity from these lessons, from this cultural text, and also, of course, against this big Cold War background, right? Yeah, thank you for your suggestion. Yeah, Heart of Darkness. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then we will we have Victor, who would like to share something, right?
Thank you very much. Just for a moment, I would like to remind of films made on the other side of the bipolar world of the Cold War. I mean the film, which is called the Russian film, Russian and Ukrainian film that is called Emergency Incident, about the capture by Taipei of the Soviet tanker that was bringing oil to mainland China. This incident happened in 1954, and in 1958, a film was made jointly by Ukrainian and Russian film companies. And I remember as a kid, I was watching this as a horror film because on the pretext that a Taiwanese inspector, a soldier, was killed, though he later turned out to be alive. The Soviet sailors were captured to Taipei, and they first lived in luxury because they were tried to be brought to the free world. And then when they denied, they were put into terrible conditions of the concentration camp. And the story goes that during the monsoon shower, one of the sailors had to smuggle the list of the prisoners to the Soviet embassy. And those who were on the list, they were returned. But some names were removed by the rain, and they remained on Taipei. So, and this film invited an audience in 1959 of 48 million people. Can you imagine that? So this is just to tell you of the power of film industry in common sense and making the appearances of the people and making animosities and controversials, even based on some real facts. The name of the tanker was Poltava. And prior to that, a few Polish tankers were also detained in the Taiwan Straits when they tried to ship oil to Beijing. Well, thank you for your attention. I find your presentations extremely interesting, and I also want to thank Dorothy, who is present in this hall, for his invitation for this superb conference. Thank you.
Was it spoken in Russian or in Polish? The film?
No. Film is made, of course, in Russian. But Russian, you can look at the title of the film in Wikipedia. It is called Emergency Incident. It is a black and white film of 1958. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much, Peter. Now we have another question from another online audience. Maybe I can read these questions which have been typed in the chat box. So it is a question to Dr. Chen, the second presenter. So thank you for your presentation. Would you elaborate a bit more about the sham marriage, actually prostitution phenomenon in Taiwan? Besides, what do you think of the similarities and differences of the term Dalumei in the context of Taiwan and Hong Kong, respectively? So, Dr. Chen, would you like to respond to it?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think, so let me explain a bit more about sham marriage and actually prostitution, this phenomenon. So I think the marriage interview targeting mainland Chinese migrant women who came to Taiwan was enacted in the year of 2003. So the reason the government decided to enact that policy is because they're trying to prevent that mainland Chinese migrant women who come to Taiwan using marriage as a way to come to migrate. While actually they are here to conduct, for example, to work in the sex industry. But that was, I think that phenomenon or this kind of practice, actually it has a very blurry or unclear definition in terms of what is real marriage and what is sham marriage, right? The boundary between the real and the sham marriage is often questioned. For example, by other scholars, another scholar, Chen Meihua, also mentioned in her research that actually for some of the officers in immigration department in Taiwan, when they try to examine if whether the marriage is real or sham, they tend to see those. So it's like to distinguish good migrant women from the bad migrant women, right? And the good migrant, by saying good, quote unquote, good migrant women, it refers to those who can perform their wife role properly in the family. And by saying bad, quote unquote, bad migrant women, it refers to, for example, if you are caught by the police that you have record working in the sex industry as a hostess or as a sex worker, then you're seen as bad migrant woman because you're not here for marriage. So the distinguish between these two is actually tricky because so the immigration assumes that if this woman is working in the sex industry, that means she's not here for marriage sincerely, right? So that's the phenomenon. Even until now, so that started, the examination of migrant women's marriage started in 2003. Even until now, the migrant women that I know, they still worry about because the migrant mainland Chinese migrant women I know, they work in the erotic tea house in Taipei, right? So they kind of worry about their residency status, because that can be affected if they got caught, if they haven't got their Taiwanese ID. So they're under constant surveillance of the government, right? So that can affect their residency and eventually affect whether or not she's going to get her Taiwanese ID card or not. So in relation to the second question, I think that's a very interesting question. And that's also, I think in future, maybe a direction that I can look more into, because I've been thinking about this question as well a lot, because I can see the similarities between the imagination of Dalumei in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. I think that also connects to the main theme of this conference. How do we narrate Cold War, and how do we understand Cold War in different places, right? Like, and I think the image of Dalumei in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, they both project a kind of imagination about communist China and a fear, the similar both fear and intimate feeling about those about people from mainland China as well. So that's my answer for now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so yeah, I know that time is almost up. Yeah, but can we spare one more question? Yeah.
Can I ask a question to Dr. Liew?
Yes.
Liew, yeah. You have mentioned two different minority groups in Malaya and then in Taiwan, right? So I wonder how you can connect them. You can elaborate more about the connections, about like under this Cold War situation, they become kind of rendered as kind of identity without identity, stateless, or kind of like exile or abandoned citizens, things like that. How could you, like, in your final scheme, in your study scheme, how do you connect them together? Yeah. Can you elaborate a bit more for us?
Yeah, sure. So I called it with settlement villages because the experience of forced migration is what I'm trying to bring out in these two places. So one, and the other thing is also like what happens after the forced migration, right? So when like after you settle in these places, and then what happens to that space that is like there? But in some ways, like both these places. So for example, the Xinchun is present in Malaya today. There's more than 450 of them. But like when I grew up, I went past them. I didn't think of all the Cold War history behind them. So it's kind of a forgotten space in that sense. Not in the sense that it's not there. It's just it's there. It's present, and people live there. And like I have a cousin who grew up there, for example. But it's not talked about as a Cold War legacy, right? So that's the interesting thing about the Liew village. It's sort of forgotten as part of a product of this forced migration, forced resettlement conducted by the British colonial state towards like Chinese, rural Chinese people who were suspected of being communist. So that is a missing kind of thing in the picture. The Chen is an interesting another example because it no longer exists in many forms because it's been demolished in many ways. Right? So many places have been demolished and reconstructed for different purposes. So that's a kind of a missing space as a physical space. And it's preserved in these sort of heritage, buildings. Maybe in Taipei, you will see, like, for example, Sisinancun. It has one, like one small remaining, like memorial for it, basically, where it's like, this is a place where the Zhengzhun used to exist, right? And like they talk about like how they came from the mainland and so on and so on. So that's more of a sort of like it's no longer present materially. But the stories of that place are still are told, and there are people doing a lot of work to talk about the legacy of this migration. So these are two different kinds of ways that they are like exile, right? But one is a material kind of exile, one is a kind of representational exile, and I wanted to put them together to show that like the Cold War, how there are these legacies of the Cold War, they are not talked about or we can't see them sometimes as we progress after to a post-Cold War situation in both places. But I would say that like the main reason why I wanted to bring these two things together is because in the works that I'm looking at, the text I'm looking at, the literature and the writing, there's a sort of concerted attempt to restore this idea of ecology, right? The ecology that used to exist before they were removed or before all people don't recognize the legacy of ecology. So that's the main connection here with the resettlement villages, is mainly the sort of missing ecology of place.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, for all the very meaningful questions and also the responses from our presenters. And thank you again for our presenters to give us the very good presentations. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you.